Captains. I'm the representative for Fiji United Land Presence. My question is, like, example, if I'm from Manila and if I want to cast my vote here in Suva, will that be possible?
Yeah, most definitely. If your address has changed, depends on where, when you registered to vote, where did you say your address was? If on the registration card your address says Vanuatu, but you'll be in Suva, you need to inform the elections office. Just on that note too, the elections office is also making provisions for what they call pre-polling. There are two types of vote, there are two instances when you can vote before September the 17th. There are Fijians obviously who live overseas, who need to vote. So they'll be doing what we call postal ballot. So the elections office will send them the ballot paper in like DHL, courier with the instructions. They'll send it to them, they'll vote, and they'll send them a prepaid courier document envelope back. So it comes back to the elections office and it'll be counted on September the 17th. There are also some people, for example, who may not be able to vote on the day itself because of, for example, work commitments. There may be people, for example, who are working as nurses, police officers, there may be, for example, a bus driver who may leave the bus stand at Suva at 6:30 a.m. in the morning, drives all the way to Lautoka, and by the time he comes back, it's 7 p.m. The polling station has not opened when he left and has closed by the time he comes back to Suva, which is where he lives. So those people can also have what they call voting on pre-polling days, and that you can make arrangements with the elections office.
I have a question. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, this was signed on the 10th of June 2010, and we've been advocating and we've been calling your office, but we haven't had any response. Is there any way you can help us to fast track the ratification?
As you know that under the Fijian Constitution, under the Bill of Rights, there is now a specific provision for people with disabilities. So there is now a legal obligation on the state or the government to implement those rights for people with disabilities. And many of those rights that are in the particular provision in the Bill of Rights complies with the Convention. Ratification, of course, is one of those processes that does take a while, but that's something that the government would need to ratify be in compliance with the Constitution. So yes, that will be done. And but I think it's also important for you to know that there is a provision in the Constitution regarding people with disabilities. There's a special provision of rights for them. So there, just to give you an example, there are many provisions. So government services, whether it's the footpath, many footpaths in Fiji don't have wheelchair access. So that's something that the governments need to work towards, and that's what we are planning to work towards. So any new footpaths that are going to be built, we need to ensure that, for example, they're wheelchair compliant. So you can cross the road, on a wheelchair. In the same way, the existing footpaths will need to be compliant with the rights that are within the Constitution itself, as an example. You also know that we have, for the first time in Fiji's history, our Constitution has been translated into Braille. It's never been done before. It's been translated in Braille in the English language and in the Itaukei language, and we are still waiting for the Hindi one that is currently being done overseas. The English and the Itaukei versions got translated into Braille in New Zealand.
The conference as well, you were talking about climate change. And together with that, I was thinking like there are a lot of sand extractions and mining extraction in some parts of the areas in Fiji. And my request to the government, if you could also think of us and people who are going to be here in the countries for more than 10 to 20 years to come. And if you could please, for the in upcoming government or for this government to please consider about the issues of sand extractions and mine extractions, and something that will all very affect our life when it comes to climate change.
And indeed, that's covered under the Constitution. You must read that particular provision. In the Bill of Rights, it says that every Fijian has a right to a clean environment. And also it's a responsibility of the government to protect the environment and the richness of our biodiversity for the future generations to come. So in the first time, it's been put into such an extent. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, what is really important is this Bill of Rights is enforceable. It is what we call justiciable. In other words, if you think that the government in itself is breaching, these rights, you have the opportunity to take the government to court. So if you think that by a particular decision being made by the government is actually adverse or it's against the Bill of Rights or a particular provision in the Bill of Rights, then you can take the government to court. It's open to anybody. In the same way now, like what I mentioned also, and we sometimes tend to forget these issues. You know, as I said to I was down in Vanuatu on the weekend, the Duavata initiative, you know, the carnival over there in Lambasa. And the Duavata initiative is about the community working together with the police to ensure that we have a reduction in crime or we minimize crime. But the point I also made is that people sometimes don't become criminals because they are criminals. They may be forced into a situation of becoming criminals. And one of the situations that forces people into criminality is poverty. You can be somebody who may be not earning any wages or maybe a low income wage earner, and you come home and you see your television and you see advertisements for McDonald's and all these fancy goods, and you may have 2 or 3 children, and obviously they want it too, and you can't afford it. And if you, for example, could be a police officer, or you could be somebody who's in a position of authority, but you're not getting paid enough income, you would then be tempted to take a bribe. If you don't have a job for a long period of time, you may be tempted to steal. So addressing issues of criminality also means addressing socioeconomic issues, addressing injustices within our society. So in the same way, this is why for the first time, the Beni Marama government has included socioeconomic rights in our constitution. Because we need to look at society as a whole. For example, there's a right to basic housing and affordable housing. There's a right to basic health care. So now, whichever government comes in 10, 15, 20 years' time, they must make enough money, or they must allocate, I should say, enough money to those areas that are in the Bill of Rights. So these are some of the safeguards that have been put in within the Constitution, but there's a definite need for all government to ensure that they adhere to the environmental standards that need to be set. You know, I don't know if you've been told, but in Tuvalu, the highest peak above sea level is 12 feet. 12 feet above sea level. So you can imagine with rising sea levels, what will happen to that country. We of course are lucky in that sense. But of course there are many low-lying areas in Fiji too, and as you know, government has recently moved some villages from the shoreline area. But this is the kind of catastrophic future that awaits some of the countries throughout the world.
I'm Joshua, a representative from the Fiji Disabled People's Federation. I just want to ask, is there any assistance given to us personal disabilities, especially for us blind vision impairment, as to how we are going to vote in the upcoming elections?
We've got a number of processes in place where they'll help you. In fact, the law has the provision where people who cannot necessarily see the ballot paper can have somebody go with them to assist them. So those provisions have been made, and within the law itself, for example, if this is the polling station, if this venue is the polling station, and a person cannot get out of the car when they come there, there's a provision that allows the supervisor of elections to get his officials to take the polling booth to the car somebody may be disabled and cannot come up, or there's some steps, etc. So all those provisions are there, and also for the visually impaired, those provisions have been made.
Thank you, sir.
Naka.
Good evening, sir. Spain, when I don't know if this is a practical question, but why don't we have a Senate?
So why don't we have
A Senate. Why don't we have a Senate?
The Senate was created in the first place because there weren't enough protections within the former constitution regarding land rights. And the Senate was never elected. The Senate was always selected. I don't know if many of you know or not. The Senate in Fiji has never been elected. What used to happen was the Prime Minister would nominate certain members, the opposition would nominate certain members. So it was never elected body. And let me put it into perspective. Fiji used to have 71 seats in Parliament, in the House of Representatives, and we had 32 or 36 senators. So that's over 100 people that were in the Parliament, in the Senate, the House of Reps, and the Senate. New Zealand, a country of a population of 4.5 million people, also has, like in our new constitution, no Senate, but it has a House of Reps. But it has about 124 seats in Parliament. 4.5 million people, 124 seats in Parliament. Fiji, not even 900,000. We had 71 seats in Parliament, we had another 36. So over 100 people were representing, supposedly representing 890,000 people, whereas in New Zealand you had 4.5 million people represented by 124 people. So it's undue expenses. It held up legislation. Under the Bainimarama government, for example, we've passed more laws in 1 year than they did in 5 years. We modernized laws. For example, there are many things that people do not know. In Fiji, only a few years ago, girls could be married off at the age of 16. If you're a female, between the ages of 16 and 21, you could be married off, or you could get married. In most cases, the parents got them married with parents' consent. If over 21, then you could go off and get married on your own. For males, it was between the ages of 18 and 21, you needed parents' consent. So we found that there was an issue. Obviously, it's not compliant with the UN standards. The UN standard says that you become an adult once you hit the age of 18. You're a child until you hit the age of 18. Now, so we had children, in particular females, being married off. People would come from overseas, poor families, they would get the daughters married off. They would see an economic opportunity for that. So we've changed the law now. The law has been changed. No person can get married who is below the age of 18 can get married. And once you hit the age of 18, you don't need your parents' consent because you're adult enough, you can go and get married. So there's numerous laws have been made. To get back to your question, that's the rationale behind it. So the Senate, the protection, so-called protection by Senate no longer needs to be covered by the Senate. Senate was never elected, it was selected, so it was not a democratic body as such, and we save undue expenses.
My question is based on the Constitution. Since we have passed the Constitution last year, what guarantee we have that the next government will is the Constitution that we have passed, enacted?
Any government that will get, or any political party that gets elected, will get elected under this Constitution. There is a provision in the Constitution, Section 2, that talks about how the Constitution is supreme law of the land, and that nobody can change. Now it's working. And nobody can change the Constitution. And if you use illegal means, then it is illegal. There is ways of changing the Constitution. To change the Constitution, for the first time again we've incorporated, they need to come back to you. So 3/4 of Parliament firstly has to agree. If they want to change a particular section, they have to agree. But that doesn't change it. Then they come back to the voters, and 75% or 3/4 of all registered voters have to agree with the amendment. Only then can that particular provision be changed. That of course would be, it's a very strong provision that's been put in to ensure that we don't have people changing our constitution willy-nilly. So there needs to be consistency, and that's the provision that's in the constitution. I hope that answers your question.